My name is Patricia Palmer Eldredge Fitzmaurice. I was born January 24th, 1932 at the Illinois Central Hospital in Chicago. The reason I was born at that hospital is my grandfather was the chief surgeon there, so everybody went there. My parents were divorced when I was, I don't know, maybe a year or so old, so I never knew my birth father. Then my mother remarried when I was about 2 years old, I would guess, and his name was Charles Eldredge, and her name was Dorothy Harsha Eldredge. My father had a summer home in Richmond, Illinois, so we used to live there in the summers. And then we would move into the city being Chicago, in the wintertime. And then when I was a little older, what we did is we would move from Richmond to Chicago, to Florida, to Chicago, to Richmond. So all the time I was in grammar school, I transferred schools all those time. When we'd go down to Florida, it would just be the women who went. The men all stayed in Chicago and worked. So I remember driving down to Florida with my grandmother, my aunt, my mother, my cousin, myself. And I've had motion sickness all my life, so I said to them, "I'm sick, you need to stop." But my grandmother didn't want to stop because she was just busy driving. Oh, by the way, I had two grandmothers in the car. And so grandmother Craig, who was my father's mother, liked to drive everywhere, but she didn't like to stop. So when I said I was sick, she didn't stop, so I threw up right down her back. So then she did stop and got out at the side of the road and changed her clothes and then got back in, and we went on our merry way. So at any rate, we all got back in the car and continued on our way. When we went to Florida, we never went to the same place. I mean, this time we were going to, I don't know, whatever town Rollins College is in, because my Aunt Polly was attending school there. So we were down there, and really two things I remember about that trip. Number one, my cousin and I had these miniature turtles, and we used to have turtle races in the backyard. And number two, my aunt had a convertible, so she used to take us for rides in it. My mother was Dorothy Harsha Eldredge. She grew up in Chicago. Her parents were William Thomas Harsha, and her mother's name was Pauline. And my mother was a very pretty woman. She did not work because at that time a lot of women didn't work, and my father didn't want her to work, so she was at home with us. She was a good athlete. She played golf a couple times a week at the local country club and won their tournament a couple times. She liked to swim and ski, so all of us children grew up learning how to do all that stuff. I had more lessons than you could imagine. And that included pretend tea parties where we learned manners. So we used to do that. My father was a stockbroker. His name was Charles Harrison Eldredge. Uh, the house in Richmond was built by, I believe, his grandfather, and he and his mother and father were divorced. His mother was British, and her name was Mabel Craig, because she had remarried at some point. And she liked to drive all over, so she would get in her car and go wherever she wanted to go. And every time she'd come to visit, we lived in Richmond right on US Highway 12, and she would back out of the driveway and kill the engine of the car, and my father would be having fits trying to stop the traffic so she could get off without being killed. And anyway, that's what she liked to do. My father was a good athlete too. He was a squash champion at his club in Chicago, and he played golf all the time. He was a good golfer and loved to ski. So they used to take all of us all winter long when we had snow, or even not, we'd go to Wilmot Hills. They made their own snow. So we would spend weekends skiing and or tobogganing on the hills of the golf course that was right behind us. And they lived in Richmond. When I was a teenager, my mother and father would go down to Miami for probably a couple months every year, and they would stay near my grandparents who had a home down there. And then after my grandparents died, my mother inherited the house, and then they'd go stay there. And so when I was in high school, by this time I was sick of transferring schools 4 times a year. So I went on strike and said that I wasn't going to go. So the first 2 years I had to go down, I just stayed out of school, and my teachers gave me homework. My last 2 years I stayed with somebody in Richmond, and they went down and I stayed at home. So, Richmond is a small town. At the time I was growing up, it was like 550 people, and everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew what everybody was doing. So as a kid, you couldn't get away with anything because somebody would always tell where you were. They always knew where you were and what you were doing, and to the extent, I mean, we had a party line, so you'd, crank the old phone, and then the operator would answer, and you'd give them the phone number, and she'd either connect you, or she might say, oh, they're not at home, they're at so-and-so's house, you want me to call them there? So that's life in a small town. One day the local reporter called our house and said, there's a strange car in your driveway, who's visiting? So, so that, again, is life in a small town. Richmond these days is like, I don't know, it's grown a lot. It's probably 3 times the population of what it was. And, your Uncle Jerry and Aunt Sandy and Hannah live there now. And your Aunt Ellen lives just about 5 miles away, so they're very familiar. I remember Aunt Ellen being absolutely astonished one day because someone wanted to know where I was living, so they went to Anderson's candy shop to ask. And of course, they got hold of Lars, who got hold of Ellen, who gave them my address. And it took her a long time to get over that since she wasn't used to small towns. In the fall, I'd start school in Richmond, and it was the Richmond grade school. I would walk to school. It was a small school, so there would be 2 classes sharing a room. So, first and second grade were together, third and fourth together, and so forth. Then as soon as the weather got cold, we didn't have central heating in the house, so we would move to Chicago. And sometimes we would stay with my maternal grandparents, who had a very large home in Hyde Park. And sometimes they would rent an apartment and we would stay there. So at any rate, I would transfer from the Richmond school to the Chicago school that happened to be close to wherever I was living at the time. So there were a number of different schools. Then about January, we would go down to Florida for a couple of months. And used to be in different parts of Florida. In later years, it was always Miami. And then I would go to school there. Then we would leave Florida about in March and move back to Chicago. So I would transfer back to whatever Chicago school I was in that year. And then about I would guess sometime in April, we'd move back to Richmond, and I would go to the Richmond school. And they got out earlier than everybody else, so probably, 1st of May or so, I was out of school. And I followed that same pattern through, I think, my 8 years of grammar school. And the result of it, I had certain gaps in my education. For example, when I started out in Richmond, my mother took me to first grade when I was 5. Then when she transferred me to the Chicago schools, they were not happy because you're supposed to be 6. However, they finally decided since I'd been going to school, I could come. So that was well and good, but now I'm in class and I've been taught how to write cursive, but they're not teaching cursive in Chicago because they don't do that in first grade. They only teach you to print. However, I didn't know how to print because they didn't teach that in Richmond. So this was something, you had to juggle around and catch up on. The other thing is that we used to learn the multiplication tables, so in all my hopping around, there were certain ones I missed and never did learn. Other than that, things seemed to go reasonably well, except for the fact that you're always being disrupted, always having to make new friends and leave old friends, so that wasn't so good. Well, before I was in high school, we used to stay in Richmond a little longer because now they had some pot-bellied stoves downstairs. So they had one in the kitchen and one in the living room, and there was, 2 rooms between, and they had these big doors that would close. So you could go from the heated one and run to the other heated one. So, we did that, and at that point, then we used to stay in Richmond until, like January, then we'd go down to Florida for 2 months, and then we'd come back to Richmond. And I was in high school then, so the first 2 years, I just stayed out of school for 2 months. And my teachers gave me assignments which I worked on and turned in when I got back. And then the last 2 years I stayed 1 year with a relative in Richmond who was an aunt of my father's, and 1 year just with a lady that lived in Richmond, and I stayed and went to school and didn't go to Florida at all. So that brings me up pretty much to college years. When I went off to college, I attended, my first year I went to Lake Forest College in Lake Forest, and I didn't like it much. So I transferred to Lawrence College in Appleton, Wisconsin, and I graduated from there with a degree in psychology in 1953. And after that, I spent a year in Europe. I went with a group called the Institute of European Studies, and we went by boat to London, and then we went to Amsterdam, and we traveled, this whole group traveling together. We went to Amsterdam, we went to Paris, France, we went to Spain, we crossed over to Morocco, and in Morocco we were going to Fez, and we lost our tour director because he didn't have the proper papers, so we all got on the train and left him. He eventually got it straightened out and met us there. And from there we went back. We were spending the school year in Vienna, Austria. And we lived with German families and attended whatever classes they gave in English, since we didn't speak any German, although we did attend German classes every day. And then during their spring break, which was like a month long, we went to Italy and traveled through Italy, and then we went back, finished the school year, came back to the U.S. After that, I found a job in human resources with Fireman's Fund Insurance Company, and I worked for them basically until I got married.
If you take the H and the I off of the word history, what do you have?
Stories.
Stories are usually about people, are they not? Which takes us to where we are now. It's important, before we get to the chandeliers and all that, to how this man started, with nothing. There was a man by the name of Potter Palmer who was neither educated or privileged. The first time Potter Palmer laid eyes on Bertha Matilda Honore, he said to himself, one day, I'm going to marry that child. But she sits him down. Mr. Palmer, I'll be more than happy to accommodate you and appear on your arm, but I want something fully understood. That's all it's going to be. That's all it's ever going to be. Potter wants to build a hotel, but he's the son of a farmer. He's not educated, but he knows nothing about any of that stuff. Potter completes the very first Palmer house, an amazing structure, 5 stories across the street. And on the day he completes it, Bertha decides to accept the proposition of both matrimony and the gift, and she becomes Bertha Honore Palmer on September 26th of 1871. Great Chicago Fire was an American tragedy. It is the second star in the city of Chicago's flag. Potter's devastated. He now started as a man who had something to a man who has nothing. The money that Potter got from Marshall Field, gone. The 300 grand Potter borrowed to build it, gone. He's got a wife of less than 2 weeks who was young, beautiful, accomplished, with soot on her face, who could have bolted. She had the whole world at her feet. She had her youth, but she didn't. Potter goes to work in building Palmer House number 2, and this is to be a building entirely composed of cement blocks, totally, completely fireproof. Potter Palmer borrows from 2 new insurance companies $1,700,000 on his signature alone. Potter said, I'm not going to be able to pay off this debt in 4 years. I need a bigger hotel. Let's not make it 6 stories. Let's make it 8. This thing was nuts. It was actually a railroad in a building. It was crazy, but it worked. Potter was the first person who used Bell's invention of the telephone. The real proof of Potter's love for Bertha is that he builds for her the world-famous Palmer Castle. Of all the buildings that are no longer here, that's the one we should still have.
My mother's mother, his name was Pauline Palmer Harsha. And her mother, whose name was Susan Palmer, was married to Potter Palmer's brother. And Potter Palmer was a very famous Chicagoan before your time. But that's the connection there. I love to travel. I'm not sure why. Maybe it really stems from my childhood when we kept moving around all the time and I never was in one place for very long. But once the children were grown, my husband and I were able to travel, and we traveled a lot of places. And when people are always asking me what was my favorite trip, and I always have to say, well, I think I can narrow it down to 2. And one was we flew to Cairo and took a river trip up the Nile. And that was just an absolutely incredible experience to see all of the different tombs and all of the, the pyramids and everything that had been built there that were thousands and thousands of years old. We had a guide who was extremely knowledgeable about the whole area and was very good at explaining things. So that was really an incredible trip. We spent a couple days in Cairo before we went to the Nile. And so one of the interesting things is we went to the Museum of Antiquities, or whatever they call it, in Cairo. And they have all of these artifacts and things from the tombs. And the thing that's amazing to anyone from the U.S. is you can reach out and touch all of these. Nothing is behind glass. They're just all sitting there. They don't even have ropes up, or at least they didn't at that time. And then we had to get up like in the middle of the night to fly to get our boat that went up the Nile. When we got back, we took an extension and spent, 3 days, I think, in Israel. And, we went to Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, and, that was all very interesting, too. My other favorite trip is we went to South America. I think we spent a month there. And we went down, first of all, to Brazil, and we were in Rio for Mardi Gras, and that was a real experience. Everything closes down, which wasn't so good because the airlines, we had a big snowstorm in Chicago. The airlines lost my luggage and I didn't get it for like 2 days. And, you know, it was cold in Chicago, it was 90 in Rio. And I bought shorts and a t-shirt from some guy at a stand because none of the stores were open, you couldn't buy anything. So I had to wear that till my clothes got delivered. And we had tickets to go to Mardi Gras, which I might add is very expensive. And you get to go there and sit in cement bleachers, and you're packed in like sardines. And this thing goes on all night, and I think we stayed there till about 2:30 in the morning. And when we left, there's still people pouring in. But we had a wonderful time in Rio. It was just a beautiful city and a lot of things to do, a lot of good food. From there, we went up to see the Iguazu Falls.
Even for giant rivers like the Amazon, the journey to the sea is not always smooth or uninterrupted. Iguazu Falls, on the border of Brazil and Argentina, is one of the widest waterfalls in the world, 1.5 miles across. In flood, 13 million litres of water spill over every second. All the world's great broad waterfalls, Victoria, Niagara, and here Iguazu, are only found in the lower courses of their rivers.
And from there we went to Manaus. And in Manaus, we went for like a 3-day cruise that Loyola had planned from Chicago, made the arrangements for. Well, we get to the dock, and the boat we're going on looks like the African Queen. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but if not, go see it, and that's what our boat was like. And there were 6 of us, and the first thing they said is, well, go down the street over there and buy whatever you want to drink. And then they had this great big thing filled with ice, and you just put your drinks in there. And you slept in hammocks. First night, the 6 of us they were strung out in one deck. After that, people moved them around. We had one kid who fell out of his hammock every night, and no one could figure out how, because the rest of us had a terrible time getting out. I mean, not easy to get in, not easy to get out. To take a shower, you went to the back of the boat with your swimming suit on, and you had a handheld shower in one hand, and you had to hang on with the other so you didn't fall off the end of the boat. So you learn to deal with that. The food was freshly, I don't know, they'd stop on shore and get food every night and had good food. The first night, our guide said to us, he said, go change your clothes and put on long pants and long sleeves. So we did it. We didn't know why. We just did it. And then we got in a little boat, and he said, we're going crocodile hunting. So maybe it was alligators they have there. Whichever. I think it was alligators. Anyway, we're floating around in the water, and he has a flashlight, and all of a sudden he reaches up and has got an alligator like this. At which point he says, who wants to hold the alligator? And I'm poking my husband saying, no, I do not want that near me. So he found about 3 or 4 of those, and then we went home. He took us through jungle hikes, and we visited some villages and the villagers there. And at one point, there's this hole in the ground, and he's saying to us that the tarantulas, there's a tarantula down there. So now there's a hole, and we're in this circle, all staring down, and he says, they can jump about 8 feet. At which point, everybody jumps back about 8 feet. And you eventually prodded one out. And I mean, they're enormous. They're the size of a dinner plate. So those were our 2 main adventures. I mean, one of the things is that the water's crystal clear, and we would go down some of the streams, and our boat was too big to go, so we transferred to a small boat. And it was so clear that when you would look in the water, you'd see the images of the trees. So it was, so those I think are my 2 favorite trips. We've, been a lot of other places too, but those are the 2 really, I think, remarkable ones. People ask, what is the worst trip you ever took? And I tell you, as far as I'm concerned, the worst trip I've ever taken in my life is driving from Chicago to Florida and back. That is something to this day I will not do. I won't drive anywhere like that. I'll fly instead. Other than that, I mean, all of the trips I've been in, I haven't had any bad trips. So, I guess another one that probably has to come close to be the exceptional, maybe the number 3, is when we went to India, because it's such just a fascinating country. And, we toured around and, saw the Taj Mahal and went on a safari through their jungle or whatever, saw a lion that had just eaten, and then a lion bathing in the water, totally ignoring everybody. Oh, except it wasn't a lion, it was a tiger. That's what they have in India. We saw the lions in South Africa. So, the fascinating thing about the Taj Mahal is it's spectacularly beautiful from the outside. And you go in, it's so dark and so crowded with people, it's awful. You can't see anything. It's just like walking through a dark room and hoping to get out soon.
Where haven't you been that you'd like to go?
I want to go to Machu Picchu, And I've heard that that's from a number of people that that's a fantastic trip. I want to go to Dubai, where I'm going the end of January. And I'd like to spend more time in Portugal. We spent, several of us spent a weekend in Lisbon before going on a river cruise, and everybody fell in love with Portugal. And other than that, I don't know. When the kids were growing up, their father worked for Midas, and one of their subsidiaries was a company that made, what do they call them? Not a camper, but, you know, the all-in-one deals.
RVs.
Yeah, motorhome. So we could get a motorhome free. So we had this motorhome, and we started in Chicago, and we had 6 kids because John and Jerry were with us. And we went across country to San Francisco and then up into Canada. Well, the first night out in the camper, nobody liked where they were sleeping, and everybody kept moving until about midnight. Their father laid down the law and bellowed, "Wherever you are now, you stay for the rest of the trip. Enough is enough." So we got that settled. Then, you know, we had a nice trip. We went through Nevada and San Francisco and up into Canada, and then we got to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and the motorhome broke down. Now, Moose Jaw's kind of in the middle of nowhere, and they told us that, you know, they had to send for a part, and they had to send away for it anyway. It was going to be a week before the part was there. So we found this house on a lake, and Loyola had to be back in Chicago for a board of directors meeting for the credit union. So I had to drive him to the nearest airport, and but then the airlines were on strike, so he could only take the airline like over the border, and then he had to take a train or something to get back in Chicago. And then he was going to meet me, come back and meet me when the motorhome was done. And he was going to meet us in Minos, North Dakota. So at any rate, the kids had a good time in Moose Jaw because we were on a lake, and they made a lot of friends that they corresponded to for years. And I didn't have such a good time because there wasn't a heck of a lot to do there. When the motorhome was finally fixed, we went there, and the whole place stopped work to say goodbye to us. And then I had to drive the motorhome from Moose Jaw to Minot to the airport to pick up Loyola. And we got him, we drove home to discover there'd been a huge storm and our basement was flooded. So that was probably our most memorable family trip. Well, I'd have to think about that a bit, but I think I'd say to them that, you know, decide what it is that you would like to do, and then simply go out and do it. You know, it may take some patience and may take some hard work, but you'll eventually get there.